They thought the worst thing they could do was capture him alive. They were wrong. What began as a routine patrol in the Pacific turned into a mistake so deadly it was quietly buried in reports. A single American soldier, stripped, beaten, and humiliated, would turn 20 minutes of chaos into a lesson written in blood. This is the story of how taking one prisoner changed everything. The American soldier was not supposed to be alone when it happened. His unit had been moving through thick jungle terrain under constant pressure, exhausted by heat, hunger, and continuous skirmishes that blurred days into nights. During a sudden ambush, visibility collapsed, communication broke down, and survival became individual rather than collective. While others pulled back toward higher ground, he was forced in the opposite direction, deeper into the vegetation where the sounds of battle faded into distant echoes. His ammunition ran dry after a brief exchange, and an old wound reopened as he pushed forward, leaving a trail he did not realize he was making. When Japanese soldiers finally emerged from the trees, rifles leveled, he understood that escape was no longer an option. He dropped to his knees not in surrender, but in calculation, already studying faces, distances, and reactions. They bound his hands tightly and searched him with quick, practiced movements, disappointed to find nothing of value. To them, he was no longer a combatant, only a captured American reduced to a burden. As they marched him through the jungle toward a temporary holding camp, he listened carefully to every word spoken, every laugh, every careless insult. The war had not ended for him. It had simply changed shape. By the time they reached the camp, the American soldier had been stripped of everything that marked him as dangerous. His boots were gone, his helmet discarded, his hands swollen from the rope cutting into his wrists. The guards pushed him forward with casual force, not urgency, because to them the threat had already ended. He was presented to others not as an enemy, but as an example, proof that resistance always collapsed eventually. Laughter followed him as he was forced to sit on the ground under watch, head lowered, body aching, surrounded by unfamiliar faces that carried no curiosity, only boredom. In their eyes, he was measured, categorized, and dismissed. The camp itself was poorly lit, hastily constructed, and full of small routines that reflected confidence rather than caution. Guards walked predictable paths, weapons slung loosely, conversations drifting freely through the humid night air. The American noticed everything without moving his head, listening to footsteps, counting seconds between patrols, memorizing who looked alert and who looked careless. The pain was constant, but pain sharpened his focus rather than dulling it. He understood that the guards believed fear had already done its work, that humiliation and exhaustion had erased any remaining will. That assumption settled heavily over the camp like fog. No extra restraints were added, no special watch assigned. To the men holding him, he was already defeated, already harmless, already forgotten. What none of them realized was that being underestimated was not a weakness. It was an opening. The treatment that followed was deliberate and slow, designed not to gather intelligence but to erase identity. The American soldier was pulled to his feet repeatedly, shoved forward, struck, then left alone just long enough for his breathing to steady before it began again. The guard spoke loudly as they worked, making sure others could see, turning his suffering into a lesson meant for every prisoner who watched from the edges of the camp. Pain became a rhythm, predictable yet relentless, and humiliation was layered on top of it to strip away dignity. They wanted submission, the kind that comes when a man stops seeing himself as capable of choice. What they failed to understand was that his mind separated sensation from intention. Each blow became information. He noted who struck hardest, who hesitated, who turned away. He listened to jokes, insults, and careless boasts, learning ranks and temperaments without ever lifting his eyes. Time stretched strangely, expanding and contracting as exhaustion crept in, but clarity remained. He controlled his breathing, slowed his reactions, and allowed himself to appear smaller than he was. To the guards, this looked like progress. To them, the American was fading, becoming compliant, becoming safe. They mistook stillness for surrender and silence for defeat. When they finally stepped back, satisfied that fear had done its work, they left him where he lay, bound but breathing, broken in their minds and finished in their plans. In reality, the process they believed would end resistance had done the opposite. It had removed hesitation. It had sharpened resolve. And it had taught him exactly how careless confidence sounded when it laughed too loudly in the dark. What the guards never understood was that the worst thing they gave him was time. Left bound near the edge of the camp, the American soldier lay still, not because he was weak, but because he was listening. Confidence breeds routine, and routine breeds carelessness. Voices rose and fell in predictable patterns as guards complained about the weather, argued about food, and repeated the same jokes they had already told earlier in the night. Footsteps followed the same paths, pausing at the same points, lingering longer where boredom replaced discipline. He counted silently, measuring distances by sound alone, noting which boots dragged and which steps carried weight. The camp itself revealed its flaws the longer it breathed around him. A loose plank shifted near the supply area. A rifle was set down too often and picked up too slowly. A guard liked to stand closer than necessary when asserting authority. None of it mattered on its own, but together it formed a map. Pain still burned through his body, but it no longer distracted him. It focused him. He tested the rope at his wrists by millimeters, feeling how fibers reacted to tension and moisture, learning what they would tolerate before tightening. Above all, he recognized the single fatal error being made again and again. They believed the danger had passed. The American was no longer seen as a man who made decisions, only an object waiting for orders. That belief changed how they looked at him, how they moved near him, how close they allowed themselves to be. The mistake was not the torture. The mistake was assuming it had worked. The opportunity did not arrive with drama or warning, but with something far more dangerous, familiarity. Rain began to fall lightly, soft enough to be ignored, steady enough to blur sound and visibility across the camp. Guards adjusted their posture, seeking comfort rather than control, shoulders relaxing as the night stretched on without incident. The American soldier felt the rope at his wrists loosen slightly as moisture soaked into the fibers, just enough to change resistance without drawing attention. He waited, not for courage, but for alignment, the moment when distraction and proximity overlapped. It came when a guard stepped closer than usual, irritated by the rain and eager to assert dominance with a casual shove rather than caution. The distance closed to less than an arm's length. In that instant, calculation replaced pain entirely. The movement was not explosive, but precise, using surprise rather than strength. Weight shifted, balance broke, and a weapon changed hands without a sound loud enough to matter. The guard never had time to understand what went wrong. The American did not pause to confirm success, because confirmation wastes seconds. He moved immediately, using the darkness and confusion of the weather as cover, positioning himself where shadows overlapped and sightlines failed. The camp had not changed, but control had. The guards still believed they were dealing with a prisoner. What they did not realize was that the moment the first weapon was taken, the roles had reversed, and the clock had begun counting down. The first minute erased hesitation, and the minutes that followed erased order. Once armed, the American soldier did not rush, because rushing creates noise and noise creates targets. He moved with the rhythm of the camp, stepping when voices rose, advancing when rain intensified, stopping when shadows thinned. Each action fed the next, not as a plan written in advance, but as a sequence shaped by opportunity. Guards reacted late and reacted poorly, assuming confusion rather than threat, firing into darkness or shouting orders that overlapped and contradicted each other. He used that confusion as a weapon, striking where attention was weakest and leaving before panic could focus. Time lost meaning as his breathing steadied and his senses narrowed, reducing the world to distance, motion, and sound. He changed position constantly, never allowing a pattern to form, never letting fear organize itself against him. Weapons were taken, discarded, and replaced as needed, chosen for silence, reliability, or range depending on the space ahead. 20 minutes is not long in ordinary life, but in chaos it is an eternity. By the 10th minute, discipline had collapsed completely, and by the 15th, survival replaced coordination. Men ran without direction, fired without targets, and shouted warnings no one could follow. When the 20th minute passed, resistance no longer existed as a concept. There was only aftermath, broken by the sound of rain and labored breathing, as the American soldier paused long enough to confirm what instinct already knew. The camp had ceased to function, and staying any longer would invite attention from beyond its borders. What remained of the camp was no longer a place of command, but a collection of reactions colliding without direction. The American soldier observed this briefly as he repositioned, understanding that chaos has a brief lifespan before it either hardens into defense or dissolves into flight. Fires were kicked over, casting uneven light that blinded more than it revealed, while shouted orders overlapped in different directions, each one canceling the last. Some men froze, unsure whether to advance or hide, while others ran toward noise that no longer represented control. He exploited this moment by never becoming the center of it, striking edges instead of cores, removing movement rather than confronting mass. The rain thickened, muffling steps and swallowing sounds, and the jungle pressed closer as if reclaiming the space. Fear moved faster than reason, and with it came mistakes that multiplied themselves. Weapons jammed from careless handling, safety catches clicked at the wrong moments, and silhouettes fired at silhouettes until trust evaporated entirely. The American kept moving, not driven by anger, but by urgency, knowing that confusion is loud even when it feels quiet. He left no trace of direction, no clear line of escape, only absence where structure had been. By the time the shouting thinned into isolated cries, the camp had lost its purpose. It was no longer a holding area or a point of control. It was simply a place where discipline had failed, and where the consequences of that failure lay scattered and irreversible. When the noise finally began to thin, the American soldiers slowed not because the danger was gone, but because it had changed. The camp no longer reacted as a single organism. What remained were isolated pockets of fear, men moving alone or in pairs, unsure whether help existed or whether anyone was still in command. He used this fragmentation carefully, avoiding confrontation where it offered no advantage and choosing moments that ended resistance quickly. Bodies lay where confusion had caught them, some near overturned supplies, others along paths that had once been patrolled with confidence. He did not count as he moved, because counting distracts, but he was aware of scale, aware that what had happened could not be mistaken for an accident or a misunderstanding. The rain washed blood into the soil, erasing clear lines but not consequences. By the time he reached the far edge of the camp, he paused long enough to listen for pursuit, for organized movement, for any sign that control was being reasserted. There was none. What he heard instead were scattered sounds of retreat and silence where voices had been moments earlier. 30 men lay dead behind him, not as a statement or a message, but as the natural result of arrogance meeting opportunity. He understood that dawn would bring questions, reinforcements, and searches that would make staying impossible. Without ceremony or hesitation, he turned away from the camp, letting the jungle close around him once more, carrying with him the knowledge that the balance of power had shifted completely and permanently. By the time daylight reached the ruined camp, what remained could not be explained easily or quickly. Survivors moved cautiously, unsure whether the threat was gone or merely waiting, their confidence stripped away by a night that made no sense within the rules they understood. There were no clear lines of attack to reconstruct, no organized assault to report, only scattered bodies, abandoned weapons, and evidence of panic replacing discipline. Messages sent up the chain of command were hesitant and vague, describing confusion, poor visibility, and internal failure rather than acknowledging what had actually occurred. Admitting that a single prisoner had dismantled an entire holding camp was unthinkable, not because it was impossible, but because it challenged the assumptions that governed control and authority. The officers who arrived later focused on restoring order rather than searching for truth, issuing warnings about vigilance while quietly removing any details that suggested humiliation or incompetence. The jungle offered no answers and no witnesses, absorbing evidence as efficiently as it had concealed movement the night before. For the men left behind, sleep became difficult, shadows felt closer, and silence carried weight. The idea that one captured enemy could reverse roles so completely lingered longer than any official explanation. The aftermath was not marked by retaliation or pursuit, but by unease, a quiet understanding that strength had been misjudged and that fear had been underestimated. Whatever reports were filed that day, they failed to capture the reality of what had happened, leaving behind only fragments, questions, and a lesson no one wanted to repeat. Leaving the camp behind was not an escape so much as a return to uncertainty, because survival beyond that point offered no guarantees, only movement. The American soldier disappeared into the jungle with no clear destination, guided by instinct rather than maps, choosing routes that avoided trails and followed terrain that discouraged pursuit. The night had taken its toll on his body, but it had sharpened his resolve, replacing pain with urgency and fatigue with focus. Every sound became a question, every shadow a calculation, as he pushed deeper into foliage that offered concealment but demanded constant attention. He understood that dawn would bring searches and that time worked against him now, yet he also knew that hesitation would be deadlier than exhaustion. The jungle accepted him without judgment, closing behind his passage, erasing footprints and swallowing signs of direction. Somewhere beyond the trees, the war continued unchanged, battles planned and fought by men who would never know what had happened in that forgotten camp. Whether he eventually rejoined friendly forces or vanished entirely remains unclear, lost among countless movements that were never recorded with precision. What endured was not his name or his fate, but the impact of a single night that exposed a flaw in certainty and control. Capturing him had seemed like a victory, a routine success that required no caution. It became instead a reminder that power depends on perception, and that underestimating a single person can unravel far more than a plan. In the end, the jungle kept a secret, and the war moved on, carrying with it a story that survived only in fragments and fear.